Hey everyone, what's up? What's up? What's up? What's up? My name is Maria Hinojosa. I'm the founder and president of Futuro Media. You know me because I'm the anchor of Latino USA and I'm the author of a new book. So you better check it out. So this Siempre Raising Our Voice mentorship course is inspired by the HBO original documentary, which I just watched, Siempre Luis. It's a portrait of this pretty extraordinary guy. He's an activist, of course, Luis Miranda Jr. And today I'm joined by a group of phenomenal people, Frankie Miranda, Monica Ramirez, and Gabi Pacheco. And we're going to talk about how one person can advance the cause of justice. So, hey, what's up? How you doing, everybody?
Hey.
So,
Doing very
super
well, thank
briefly,
you.
good, good, good. So, super briefly, I'm just going to give, because everybody has the internet, so I don't need to give the full introduction. But you know, Gabi Pacheco is the program director, one of the program directors at the Dream US. She's a badass, leader, uh, dreamer. Yes, you are. That's all you. Yes. And we're going to talk about how Gabi became this leader and historical presence in the United States of America. Frankie Miranda, president and CEO of the Hispanic Federation, which is a pretty important organization. Yes, shout out to Frankie. And Monica Ramirez is the co founder of the Latinx House, and also an incredible activist who, across all the boards, I mean, the three of you really, in my view, have changed history. And I know that for Latinos and Latinas right now, we feel so kind of invisible and beaten down. I just think that's a reality. That then to kind of be like, wow, well, we're history makers, we're Latinos and Latinas, and we're history makers. It's a lot to take on in this moment because I think we also are humble. But I actually want to do just a roundabout check-in. So, Monica, like this is something we do on In the Thick. It's just a temperature check just before we start talking about this road to activism. What's your temperature check? Like, how you feeling? How you doing?
I think that I'm doing as well as can be expected under the circumstances. It's a whirl. I feel like we're in this whirlwind and we're just trying to keep up. And so I really just feel like I'm racing right now.
Yeah, I know. Frankie, how about you?
I am, to be honest with you, angry. I am angry that, living in New York and suddenly being the epicenter of this pandemic, seeing the refrigerated trucks at the hospital next to me in Queens being added every single day, we thought that the country was going to listen and that our suffering in New York was going to mean something. The many that we lost in our community was going to be a lesson for the rest of the country, and people didn't hear anything. They didn't listen, including the president.
And I'm a survivor of COVID, so that's exactly the way I felt. It's just like nobody took us seriously. And look what New York, this place of immigrants, this place, a city of Latinos and Latinas, essential workers, where we transformed what was possible, and yet we were being dismissed. So I feel your anger. Y tú, mi querida Gaby, cómo estás? What's your temperature check at this moment?
So, a couple of things. Every time I wake up in the morning, I look at my alarm, and in my alarm, I have a reminder, and it says, "Time to conquer your world." And right now, I know that there's so much happening out there, but I'm trying to really focus more on myself and have a more positive outlook because if I allow for all the news and everything that's been happening every other day, you turn on the TV or you look at social media and it's another thing of we're like, seriously, 2020. But there's a thing that now I have taken upon myself, and it's life is tough, but Gabby Pacheco's tougher. So right now I have this attitude that we as a community are strong, that we need to come together more than ever, and that whatever happens, we're going to persevere.
So does that mean, Gabi, because people remember you because you were one of the you were like the first dreamers who said we are the dreamers. We're going to walk from Florida to Washington D.C. Um, that's a very big public, selfless act in many ways. it feels like you're saying that this moment, because we're talking about activism, we're talking about a life of activism, about how you make a commitment to activism because you make a commitment to justice. But can you talk a little bit about that moment when you decide to walk to manifest who you are to where you are now when you're waking up in those mornings?
So two different places, right? During that time, we felt that our lives were at risk every single day. In 2006, immigration had come early in the morning before the sun had rised and detained my parents and my sisters. And we had gone through, right, the deportation proceeding and the hell that puts not just my family, but the community, the people that had hired my parents and my sisters, etc., our neighbors. And I knew that there was just no other option. And I also knew that people were kind, that if people listened and if we were able to get our stories out, that at least we could plant some seed that hopefully can spur something and can spur people into action, or at least start questioning these things that were being said about immigrants, Latinos, etc. And so today, 10 years, which is kind of incredible that some time has passed. And at the same time, so much has changed, yet so little has changed. I'm at the point where if you look at the documentary and you look at the life of Luis, he suffers a heart attack. He is walking around with a leg brace. And I look at that and I'm like, I don't want to get to that point where all the stress and everything that we have to take on, not just as activists, but as people that live within the community, right, and feel and know what is happening, that it starts affecting our health.
Right. So, Monica, give us, thank you, Mamita. Thank you for that, by the way. Thank you. So, Monica, give us the short answer as to how you end up into, spurred into activism. Gabi, as she says, it was, yeah, everything else had been exhausted. There was nothing, you had nothing more to lose. And I'm wondering if you can make, after you talk about your entry into activism, what you think about what Gabi is talking about now, which is you have to have the self-love, because this is activism that is generational. This is going to have to. We understand now. This is not going to be done in a decade. This is going to be done in multiple decades. Monica.
Hmm. Yeah, so my entry into activism was really it was curiosity. Because I started really young. I was 14 when I really started getting more engaged in the community, and it was because I recognized that our area newspaper had essentially erased farm workers, even though farm workers come to my town every June when fishermen also arrive in my town, and there'd been this whole pull-out section dedicated to fishermen returning to town. And I was really bothered by that, and I didn't understand why that had happened. And so I asked my dad about it, and my dad said, "Well, you should ask them." And I live in a really, really small place. And so I literally hopped on my bike and I rode down the street and I went to the newspaper and I asked the editor, why wasn't there a welcome back farm worker section of the newspaper? And the editor of the newspaper, who I knew because I knew his children from school, he said he didn't know, and then he invited me to write about it. And so that was when I started writing about farm workers in the Latinx community, and and it was through that process of curiosity and then also understanding the impact of being invisible that really has fueled really even today my activism and my work, because I understood, I guess, then that there was a real consequence to not having the stories of farm workers told. And I understand today, of course, the consequence of having the stories of our community not told or told completely incorrectly, and the real ways in which our community has suffered and continues to suffer because of their erasure and misrepresentation of our community. So that was how I started as a 14-year-old curious kid, and I just kept going. And as I continued to learn, I became outraged and wanted to figure out how to fix some of the problems that I was seeing. my activism has really always been rooted in my community, in the farm worker community. And so I guess, how does that bring me to where I am in terms of my own journey around self-care and self-love? I have to say it's been a real challenge because it's difficult to put the guardrails in place. When you're living in a situation in which your community is suffering and you're, hearing stories from people about the ways that they've been harmed. And in my work, women who've been victims of sexual violence at work, it's really difficult to put limitations on how much you can help or how much you feel like you can give to the causes that we're working on. And so I have definitely not mastered self-care or self-love. It's a continuing process of figuring out how to step back. And actually, for me, watching the movie, I think one of the things that I really took from it and really allowed me to think about my own life and my work is the way that Luis just always centered his family. And, even though things were so busy and he was working on so many different kinds of campaigns, his family was always at the center. And that reminds me that even if I'm on the road, several weeks a month, that I always have to come back to my family to help stay grounded and rooted.
So thank you, Mamita. Thank you for that story. And I love your engagement with the media, because that's exactly what we need to do. We need to be challenging it every time. Frankie, you run the Hispanic Federation, which is such an important organization. And as I was watching the film, I was thinking like, wow, this is a lot to take on when, Lin-Manuel and Luis decide to do this with and for the Hispanic Federation. So I'm interested in that, but of course, give us your brief story of how you decide, because your activism is a little bit different, right? Your activism is a lot different from what Gabby did. So your entry into activism and how you see yourself, at this point in the receiving end of the activism of Luis Miranda.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how do I start in? How do I get started? It is really at some point I just needed to just stop running away from my own reality. I am this gay boy that grew up in the mountains of Puerto Rico in a small town, severely bullied, abused, and that my only escape was to try to just be very determined to do what my parents said that I needed to just study. They grew up in extreme poverty in Puerto Rico, and they truly believed that my way of becoming something was through my studies. And while I kind of like run away from my hometown and I was trying to run away a little bit from my own reality, at some point there was a moment in which I couldn't run away anymore. And I think that the most important moment that told me I cannot run away anymore is when the love of my life was deported in 2003. And the only reason why he was deported was because marriage equality was not a reality in this country. And that is the moment in which I decided that I needed to speak out and also talk about Latinos, talking about visibility for Latinos, that we are just not one dimensional, that there are a lot of intersectionalities and there are many different issues that are part of our community. And because of that, I was already working at the Hispanic Federation, and then the organization started to hear more and understanding more that we needed to branch out and do many more issues that we needed to cover in our policy making, in everything that we were doing. And I became one of those people in front of the Supreme Court, trying to explain to people that domestic partnership was not enough, that we needed full equality, and that we needed to be just seen just not only as HIV, Latinos and LGBTQ community was all around HIV/AIDS, and that still continues to be a very important issue. But there were many other issues, immigration. There were many issues that also we needed to talk about when we were talking about Latinos and LGBTQ community. So that is my push, my being my real self, being able to open about my pain and my suffering. And when marriage equality became the law of the land, I was able to bring back who is today my husband and who is an American citizen today. And that told me
Wow.
that I
Wonderful.
today, thank you, thank you. And that is what, for me, became kind of like that moment. It's just like, stop running away, being yourself, tell your story, because more and more people are going to listen and understand what is your story. And of course, the Federation is an incredible vehicle. Luis Miranda is the founding president of the Hispanic Federation 30 years ago. He had this idea that we need an organization that could support other nonprofits working in communities, working with Latinos, and providing that support for those organizations. And today, we are now 253 organizations across the country, and we are one of the leading organizations in Puerto Rico for the relief effort, something that you can see in the movie. And also today, we have invested $14 million in organizations that are at the forefront of being the first responders of COVID-19 in Latino communities and communities of color. So again, it has been kind of like a long journey, but at the same time, it is that message for everybody. You need to tell your story. You need to be real. You need to be, if you're in corporate America or you are in any setting and you talk about yourself honestly, you are going to be an activist on itself.
It's really interesting because now both of my adult children have graduated from college. But I would tell my daughter, because also I'm a professor now, because I'm a Mexican immigrant, so I have 16 jobs. One of them is being and I would tell my daughter when she was in college, if she was like, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it, if I'm not going to be able to get the paper in on time. And I said, talk to your professor. Just talk to them and say what's going on. And you'll be surprised because they actually will be like, oh, okay. But if you don't say anything, that's where it becomes a problem, which, Monica, you were talking about the issue of invisibility. And also, I think one of the things that I'm taking away from this is that we all get into this business of being connected to an issue or various issues because of something deeply personal, something very, 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 very personal. So I do want to ask you about, Gabi, actually about what you said, because I mean, this film is very interesting in that you don't expect the first scene to be Luis Miranda showing his chest. Like it's just like wait, what? So immediately you're just like, okay, this is not going to be a typical kind of documentary about, oh, this person is less like da da da. But Gabi, you just said that actually was something that was it was quite disturbing. And for me too, like I was getting towards the end of the film, and I know how it ends because Luis Miranda asked me to do this, so I know he's okay. But towards the end of the film, I was a little bit like, are you going to be okay? Like, stop running around so much. Like, you need to take better care of yourself. Like, you need to go to sleep. Don't, you're really saying, Gabi, that there is something in you that is saying, yeah, I'm going to shut down at 10 o'clock. Click, goodbye. And you're putting that first. So, talk a little bit more about what that feels like in the context of the deep activism that you and everybody on this panel has done. What it's like to just be like, I'm going to be a better activist if I sleep 8 hours than if I sleep only 4, thinking I'm going to get a lot done.
I wish it was 8 hours. We're talking about maybe 5 or 6 right now. The hardest thing to do is to be an activist for yourself. And a lot of the times we do things for others. When I was a kid, I used to call myself, and the way I reflect this, I was like the bully of the bullies, right? But if somebody came and bullied me, I just would take it or would go home and cry or whatever, right? So it's really hard. It's one of the most difficult things that I'm trying to do, and I've done in my life. Actually, try to take care of myself. But um, the thing that I'm learning is that we all have choices, and every day we get up with the blessing of a new day, and we have a choice. And um, understanding and knowing that the journey that I have, because honestly, I remember in 2008 when everybody thought that President Obama was going to be the salvation and that we were going to get immigration reform and everything, unicorns and rainbows. And then it's 2009 and there's more deportations than we've ever seen. And so that shows me, right, two things. One is that as an activist and an advocate, my role is not so much to call out or to side with a particular party, right? But to call out all the BS and all the injustice and the terrible policies that people in power that have control over our lives are doing to us, right? And then the second thing, right, is that we live in such silos, right? And if there's anything, there's like I think a new thing that has come out about social media and how it tailors right to us. And our friends applaud everything we say and everybody, right? But are we telling the stories and are we talking to the right people? Are we being the Monicas who are getting on that bicycle to talk to the editor of the newspaper and saying, what's up with this? Are we being the Luis Mirandas, right? Who say, no, leave these kids who are protest on stage because they have something to say, right? There's a valid thing that they need to say. And so I think for me, that has like pausing, stepping back a little bit, and even looking at myself and reflecting of my own activism has allowed me to even, I believe, right, grow a little bit and see things that I have been doing for many years as an activist, as an advocate, that might not necessarily be right or wrong, right? I did what I had to do during that time and what felt right for me then. But that now, right, I need to do a little bit different. And part of it is not just taking care of myself, but also ensuring that what I'm doing is adding, right, to what I'm trying to do, which is find equity and justice for all.
So I love this notion of being an activist for self. Sometimes when my daughter will be really down on her, because also Latinas were experts at being down on ourselves. We have such high expectations, right? And so I tell her, Mamita, you should talk to yourself the way you talk to your girlfriends. And it's an interesting way that we're often very sympathetic for others, but we have a hard time showing compassion for ourselves. And I think, Monica, that this notion of, like, for example, that editor at the newspaper, he could have shut the door on you and just said, "Who are you?" But in fact, he listened and then he gave you an opportunity. But you said, "Okay." There was something in you, like there was something in Luis, that kind of was like, I'm gonna jump at this. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna go for it. I mean, I know it was a little bit more complicated than when Luis says, suddenly there was an opening at Mayor Koch in his administration. He just decided
Right.
to apply. It was a very political environment. So Luis was very connected, but nonetheless, he was going into a fire pit. I mean, I meet Luis as a young journalist, and my first moments with Luis were all about challenging him. I was beating him up. I was a little journalist, and I was like, Luis Miranda, you stand for Ed Kochwell, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we fought. I was a young, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is this notion of jumping into the idea of being a leader, and the discomfort and the scariness about that. And how have you processed that so that other people who get stuck in the, I'm not going to say yes to write it, I'm not going to get on the bike. How do you go about thinking about how to unlock that?
Yeah, I think that the reason that I was able to jump in was in part because I didn't know any better, I wasn't scared of it because I didn't know what could go wrong, from being engaged in that way. And I think that, I still get scared in my leadership because we're always trying new tactics, we're building new campaigns, and we don't know what will come of what we're doing. And I think that the way that I have dealt with it, and the way that I hope that people who are thinking about getting engaged in activism or advocacy would think about it is that, we have to be willing to just experiment and to understand that it's going to require some shifts sometimes. We might have to start over, and to allow ourselves that grace to understand that we might not do it perfectly, but at least if we jump in, we can try to make things a little bit better. And I think, if I had decided to just get back on my bike and go home and just tell my dad what they said about, the newspaper, not thinking about farm workers, and that could have been the end of it. But I guess it was just, I just jumped in because I understood that he gave me a challenge to do something, and I was willing to try it. And in our activism still today, that's what we do. We just keep trying things, understanding that this is a long road, and it's going to take a long time for us to fix many of the things that we're trying to address. And we don't have the perfect solutions. If someone had the perfect solutions, then many of the problems that we're trying to work on would have been cured a long time ago. And so my advice to people is, hold the fear, acknowledge the fear, but don't allow it to stop us from trying, because even in trying, we can make some gains.
So I want to talk for a second about the decision that you made, Monica, to write. I remember that was, I think, when I first remember, like, oye, me, this Monica is extraordinary. You write the Dear Sisters letter. This is 2017. It's, the Me Too movement. And you insert yourself in this national conversation. You basically say, you're talking about Hollywood. I'm talking about farm workers. And it really, I remember just thinking, man, what a visionary. What a visionary. But I mean, I have deep respect for you, Monica, in that moment where you're like, and I'm gonna pen this thing and I'm gonna stand up, and like the assuredness of knowing that you had to insert yourself into this national conversation. Like the invisibility was such that you had to do it. Can you take me to that moment when you were like, es que I have to write this, tengo que escribirlo?
It's interesting because, I'm an empath. I feel deeply. And at that moment, as the stories were coming out about, Harvey Weinstein, and the survivors who were speaking out against him, and other survivors in Hollywood who were starting to talk about the violence against them, because in the farm worker movement, we have worked on this issue of sexual harassment and sexual violence against farm worker women for so many years. You know, and understood the risk that it took to come forward to tell those stories, and the possible retaliation against people for telling those stories. I just felt it deeply. Like, I felt a lot of fear in that moment, for the individuals who are coming forward. And when I was talking to other members of Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, the organization for whom I wrote the letter, then as the board president, we all shared this sort of, we were this fear. We were afraid that there was going to be something that would happen, to the women who were speaking out, and that they were going to be silenced. And so it was really from this place of concern, where we felt like we just had to speak out, because if we didn't, and no one else was speaking out in their defense at that time, there was a real risk that they were going to be silenced. And if they were silenced, then that could very well have been the end of anyone coming forward. And we know that happens all the time in the farm worker community, and with immigrants in our community who have been harmed, who become afraid to speak out because of retaliation. So really, at that moment when the decision was made to say something, um, it wasn't in the form of a letter, actually. um, we wrote a statement. We wanted to deliver a statement, to the women, and we were going to attend a march that we'd heard about. And so we had organized for 30 farm worker women to attend this march and to read the statement at the march. But an intervening circumstance happened in that time. Magazine reached out because they were working on their Silence Breaker story, and I'd mentioned the statement that we wrote, and they asked me to share it with them, and they ended up publishing it as a letter. And so it was, I think that that is again an example of we didn't know what was going to come of it. We didn't have a grand plan. We hadn't strategized around having it go in a national publication. We just felt like something needed to be done urgently, and we had something to say about it, and we felt like we could speak to it. And I think that it was really because it came from a place of love and because it was a genuine act of kindness. I think that is why that letter really took off in the way that it did, because it wasn't something that was calculated.
So I love that. I love the fact that you keep on saying you don't know. I remember como que me cayó el 20 when I just suddenly was thinking about Martin Luther King, who was my hero. I was alive when he was alive. I saw him. And just thinking like when I was much older, like, es que Martin Luther King he didn't have a playbook. He didn't know. It wasn't like he understood it was going to go from here to this thing that you're talking about, that there's just a motive. There was something that you understood needed to be done. And you then take on the risk. You look at the fear and you're like, we're there, but we're going to do this anyway. Frankie, for you to be open about who you are in your entirety, it takes a tremendous amount of vulnerability and fear. And I'm wondering, as somebody who is now leading such an important organization that was started by Luis Miranda, one of the things that's connected with people who are reading my book is that I'm talking about the imposter syndrome. I talk about it a lot because I'm like, it's my sombra. It was always with me. It was my little shadow. And I'm just wondering how you deal with your fear of when you get to these places where you're like, es que I'm leading the Hispanic Federation. And yes, we have Martin Luther King Martin Luther King actually had a dream. We have to create 5-year strategic plans.
Right.
Right? But
Right.
how do you manage that notion of like the dream and the strategic plan and not getting overwhelmed and staying again to this kind of core vulnerability, which is what made you speak up like everybody else?
It's a hard question, and thank you for it, because on my first day, when I was going to have a meeting with my team and said, we're going to talk about 2020, about the priorities of 2020. And we always thought that 2020 was just going to be civic engagement and census and voter registration and get out the vote. And on my first day is the earthquake in Puerto Rico. So we had to start not being able to think about anything and reconnect, re-energize that network of organizations that we had supported 2 years before, that we were working with, that they were the first responders in Puerto Rico when the local government collapsed and the federal government was nowhere to be found. And that you have a president visiting the island and tossing paper towel on Puerto Rico and basically saying this was a success, nothing happened really here. So first day at the job, we need to launch into disaster mode. So there has been not a lot of time to think. And a few weeks later, New York shuts down because of the pandemic. So when you talk about questioning yourself every single day and trying to convince yourself that those scripts that are in your head when you were young and you were teased and you were bullied and people basically bet that you were not going to do anything in your life, and then suddenly you are faced with so much uncertainty, and on top of that, everything else that is happening with the social justice movement, Black Lives Matters, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other people that had been people of color that continues to be abused. It is really hard. But Monica and Gabby exemplify this. You have no choice. You have to just continue. You have to be yourself. You have to just face these consequences. And I don't think that I have it all together, that I have it all perfect. But what I do have is a community of people, not only within the Hispanic Federation, but in a network of organizations that they have the real compass. They are the ones telling us, the community is telling us. We see it every day. So while this syndrome, imposter syndrome, is so real, and everybody had basically said, you don't need to be seated at the table, or there are certain things that you can actually talk about, but this other thing, that's not for you guys. It is constantly being reminded us that we just need to push forward. And Gabby and Monica are incredible in everything that they have been able to accomplish. But I also want people to understand that they can also, with very little changes, they can also be part of this community of care, of this community of compassion, that people can actually be themselves and be able to volunteer, be part of a board, or just take out what you're doing. We know that you care on social media, but we need to take an extra step. We need to participate in the census. We need to register to vote. Just doing that, you are also being an activist. You are being telling people, I am here. I am informed. So it is a struggle every single day. But being inspired today with this company of amazing women, we can do anything.
Democracy is a verb, ultimately. It's not like, you vote. I mean, I've just started to say to people, if you really have a problem voting, then just do it for somebody who can't. Find somebody who really wants to vote and just do it for that person. Be a little self-sacrificing. I'm thinking about this notion of not knowing any better. Like, well, I didn't know any better. I mean, I was just going to do it, right? And how that can also be helpful, kind of like jumping into the deep end. When I created Futuro Media, I mean, I was like, I got to create, like, I didn't want to go on unemployment, and I didn't have a job. So I'm like, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to try and create this thing. I mean, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm not really sure, but I'm going to try and create this thing. And there's an element of this riskiness that can be very lonely, but at the same time, like, there's the self leadership, but there's also, like, we're in a group. Like Luis in the film, you see that he's leading, but he's also got a group of people around him. It's not like you're completely alone in this. And I wanted to just have your thoughts about, like, you're not completely alone when you're doing this activism. I mean, we're not. Gabi, when you were walking, you were with 3 other people, ¿verdad?
And actually, as Frankie was talking, it was reminding me of that, because it wasn't just 3 people walking. It was 4 different women, one of them doing logistics, one of them calling ahead to make sure we had a place where to stay and where to sleep, another one letting all the little local newspapers know, hey, they're coming in town. Do you want to write about this? It seems like it might be interesting to you. And then we had maybe 30 other young dreamers. There was actually a hydration and nutrition committee. They wanted to make sure that we were drinking enough water and eating well, right? So that statement of "it takes a village" is real. And I want to say something really to add to this conversation of activism and advocacy, right? It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be MLK, you don't have to be, Mahatma Gandhi or, whoever, right? The little thing. So I have a friend who's 35 years old, has never voted, and saw how important it was. I cannot vote. I am not a citizen yet. And he decided on his own to look for this information, was a little frustrated by it, but got the information and has registered to vote. And it just was so meaningful. And it just seemed, right, like he cares, and he's not he's not politically active, doesn't really follow what's happening, but understands and knows how important it is for me, right, for his voice to be, used in the ballot. And so I think one thing that the film also teaches me, right, is that Luis, the more he got engaged or the more he did, the more roads open up and the more opportunities people have, right? And so it just takes that first step. When you are going to run a marathon, you don't just like put your shoes on and start running, right? You first look for the right shoes. You start jogging. You do, maybe a half a mile first, and then a mile, and then etc. And you start building up. And I think that for at least for me, that's how it was, right? I am where I am today, where I work at the Dream.us. We've raised over $200 million for scholarships for dreamers. We are now trying to raise money in order to start loan programs because our 6,000 plus dreamers that have gotten scholarships, many of them have graduated and now they want to go to grad school and they want to go to medical school and law school and business school and they want to work at Silicon Valley and be in tech and etc. Right? And so we want to help them because we know that helping them helps the communities and helps our country, duh, right? But we first started, I remember our first meeting where the question was asked, raise your hand if you want to help raise $1 million. And I was like, oh my God, how are we going to do this? And I'm like, this. And my first meeting was pitching to a company for $20 million. After that meeting, I got such a big migraine and I got to meet one of my heroes and like ultimate favorite, Gloria Stefan. And I had such a migraine. Thank God I was able to say, excuse me, I need to go because I actually got really sick. And my thing is, when I first met Gloria Stefan, I almost threw up all over her. But it was because my channel, right? They told me go ask for $20 million. And I was like, what? Right? So $200 million later, right? This organization that started 7 years, started from nothing. And my activism really just started, like Monica's, from saying, there's something wrong here. Why can't dreamers go to school if I want to go to school? And women have been suffering this for many, many years. You had Sor Juana, having to become a nun so that she can be able to study. Like, this doesn't make any sense in my mind. Why can we, in this, day and age, the 21st century, why can't young people who want to go to college, right? So I think it really is just starting small. And I want people to know that, right? We're not superhumans. We were not chosen by a higher being, right, to do this, right? We're just people that were fed up with something or had a question or said, this is wrong and I need to say and share my story.
So we've got like 2 minutes, 3 minutes before we wrap. Thank you for that, Mamita. I appreciate that. Frankie, one of the things in the film that I found very interesting was the fact that you are seeing Luis Miranda and Lin-Manuel Miranda being criticized. Some people might want to just put the shiny veneer on it all because Lin-Manuel is, he's Lin-Manuel. Some people are like, you cannot criticize him. And yet in the film, there is this level of self-criticism. So just as we wrap up, your thoughts on what was one of your other favorite takeaways from the film that is going to inspire you in your activism as we move into what's going to be a very difficult next decade, I think?
Well, it is important, as Luis said during the film, that it's important that all voices are heard, and that when you are going into an environment when people have been abused and that people have not been receiving the fair share, they're going to have strong opinions. And for us is also to really listen. We don't have all the solutions, right? And we need to just make sure that we are also welcoming these opinions so we can make better and more informed decisions. And for me, watching the film, going back to the moment in which we saw the images for Hurricane Maria, it transported me back to that moment in which I did not know whether my mother and my dad were alive or not. We were not able to communicate. We were not able to connect. We were incommunicated at that time. And going on my first trip to Puerto Rico to actually coordinate the distribution of goods, I actually had to go to the town of Corozal to bury my grandmother. And while I was in the funeral home with generators and the worst conditions in which you can do this, I am on the phone with the mayor because the mayor has been disconnected from the distribution centers from San Juan and trying to get them a shipment of food for people in need in Puerto Rico. So I have to stop to watch and have a good cry because I realized that I have not really had time at the moment to really go through the emotions that I had, and they has been bottled inside of me for 3 years. And watching the movie was it was catharsis for me. It was very cathartic because I was able to just finally put it out. So that's the moment in which it reminded me that I need to continue doing the work that I do.
Thank you, Frankie. There were moments where we could get teary-eyed. Monica, take us out. You again are such an inspiration to so many of us. What do you want to leave the people who are watching this, who are thinking about how to be engaged? What do you want to leave them with from either yourself or from what you want to take away from the film?
Well, I think that for me, one of the big takeaways from the film was that, Luis has remained nimble and he's always been building to bring in as many people as possible to build with him. And I think that as we consider our work in advocacy or activism, it's really important for us to remember that it isn't about one person. We're trying to build for all of us. And so we need to bring as many people together as possible. And that is the way forward. It should not be centered on one person ever. And I think Luis has done an incredible job with his leadership to mentor, to make big coalitions, to create incredible organizations. And that is our work, to continue making space by bringing more people with us so that together we can make things better for all of us.
So ultimately, the message is we're all afraid. We don't necessarily have a master plan. We're deeply emotional. We're working stuff out. We want to practice self-love. We want to give of ourselves. And all of this is really, I think, here motivated by tremendous feelings of love. So I just want to say this was beautiful. I wish I had had a webinar like this. When I was growing up, there were no computers. So that's not true. Computers. By the time I was in college, I wasn't using them. Gaby Pacheco is with the Dream US, Frankie Miranda, President and CEO of the Hispanic Federation, Monica Ramirez, co-founder of the Latinx House. Thank you so much for joining me on this conversation of the impact of what one person can do. One person. We love you. Thank you so much. And I'm so thankful that you brought it con todo corazón. So thank you. And take this webinar to heart. We give it with love.